That's me. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you very much, especially to the organisers and to Chloe, who has made it all so easy. And I get quite a lot of invitations to speak at events, but this is something very special for me, actually, because I actually used to do what you do for several years. I was also a teacher of English as a second language, as it was called in those days. So when I was invited, I thought, oh, this is, it's like coming home. But I'll get onto that later, because before I became a teacher of English as a second language, of course, I was also a learner of English as a second language. And really, that's where my journey through the mystery and magic of language begins. So on my website, there's a potted biography that tells you that I was born in a displaced persons camp in Germany in 1946. That was me. My parents were Ukrainian, and they'd been abducted by, as indeed many Ukrainians and Poles were, by the invading German armies, put on trains and sent to work in German munitions factories. And they were destined not to be annihilated, as the Jews were, but to be turned into a slave race, whose role would be to serve the master race. Well, fortunately, that didn't happen. And we were lucky enough to be able to come to Britain when the war ended and to make a new life here. Most of the Ukrainians and Poles in Britain come from the western part of Ukraine, which had once been part of the Polish Empire. But my family came from further east, and it was only really a fluke of passports and destiny which allowed them to come here in 1947. So there was always a sort of a slight fear among my parents that they would be sent back. And my parents, especially my mother, had struggled to learn German in that sort of terrible situation in the camps, and then coming to England had to suddenly adapt to talking yet another new language. It wasn't such a problem for my father because he was already a bit of a linguist. He knew German, Russian, English, as well as Ukrainian, and his own father had been a professor of languages. But my mother really struggled, and of course at that time there were no English classes available for people like her. And I do often think about the difference it would have made to her if she'd been taught English professionally and systematically. She could have returned to education, she could have followed up a career. Before the war, she'd actually started to train as a vet. But in the end, she worked as a cleaner, a domestic, and actually, most of all, her job was being a mother. She was fluent and widely read in Russian and Ukrainian. She could get by in German. But she spoke terrible English to the end of her days. Our first English teachers, that's me and my mum, when we came to England, we lived in a refugee camp, and then we were taken in by rather grand Sussex families. Not yet. And my father went off and drove tractors. My sister went to the local school. In fact, she picked up enough English in a year to pass the 11 plus. But my mum and I stayed at home, and she was the housekeeper, dog's body, and eventually she was a carer. And we were taught English by the ladies of the house. The first one was Kitty Dobbs, and she later became the mother-in-law of Malcolm Muggeridge. And maybe that's why I ended up with such a posh accent. After that, there was a Miss Winifred Morton, also very, very posh. And she was sort of elderly and bedridden, but she taught me nursery rhymes. And I think at that age, now it's about 3, your brain's like a sponge and it soaks up everything that's fed to it. My father also spoke to me in English a bit, and my sister, once she'd started going to school, although his English was always very heavily accented and idiosyncratic. But with my mother, I always spoke Ukrainian, and so it literally was my mother tongue. That's me. That's the house, one of the posh houses that we lived in with Mrs. Kitty Dobbs, and it's the only picture I've got of that age. There I am feeding the ducks. When I was 4, we moved up to Yorkshire, and I lived in a mining village just outside Doncaster, and that's where I started school. And the English I learnt at school was quite different to the English of Mrs. Dobbs and Miss Morton. And in fact, when we went to visit during the holidays, she was horrified that I'd picked up a Yorkshire accent, and she ticked me off for saying I was going upstairs to bed. I don't know what's happened to that accent now. Possibly too much education. You can have too much, can't you? Anyway, once I settled in at school, that's where I really mastered English. It became my own language and something I didn't share with my mother. So in a way, it was almost like a private language. And now there have been a lot of studies that show that far from being a disadvantage, growing up bilingual actually makes you more brainy, which must be true because look at me. And the theory is that you learn quite early on to separate off subject matter from language. Anyway, I thrived on it, and I really grew up fascinated by languages. As you said, I loved the variety of sounds that you could make, the rhymes and rhythms that really were like magic spells. And I was even intrigued by the bizarre spelling. And just as other children play with plasticine or splash around with paint, I played with words. I wrote stories and plays for my dolls. I wrote my first poem when I was 4. And that was the start of my 50-year-long career as an unpublished writer. Well, not entirely unpublished, because I just remembered that when I was 14, I had a limerick published by the Women's Institute magazine to celebrate the Russian Venus probe rocket, which my proud mum sent into the Women's Institute magazine. And actually, it's quite good. So here it is. A guy with an eye on the distance, so keen on serene coexistence, to Venus sends rocket, love potions to pocket, to lend the next summit assistance. And as you can see, thank you. I know, I was really proud of it, actually. And as you can see, I was already besotted with the rhyme. I'd got the rhyme, I'd got the rhythm, I got the alliteration and assonance, and I even had a handle on metaphor and classical illusion. And I actually have to thank my wonderful English teachers at school for that, and also for my lifelong habit of memorising poetry. And I must admit, I had to hold my tongue when Michael Gove came up with the idea of making it compulsory for school children to learn poetry by heart, because actually I think it's a great idea. And I actually carry reams of poetry around in my head, which I really value. I can sort of bring it out in almost any situation. But I can't quite bring myself to agree with anything that Michael Gove says. So I'll have to keep quiet about that. At school, languages became my thing, and having started off with the English and Ukrainian, it made it quite easy to pick up others. So I took 3 languages at A-level, English, French and Russian. I also did German at O-level. And at university, I studied English and philosophy. And that's when I started to write quite a lot of poetry. I won't read you any more of that, though. But I have to say that I did want to be a poet more than a novelist at that age. Because I think, in a way, poetry is a form that really puts the language it's written in through its paces. And also at university, it's when I began to have a more mature appreciation of the language that I really now felt was my own and something sort of very, very special. And one of the things I learned is that English is actually a dual heritage language. It's got one parent from up north, and that parent's passed on words with Germanic and Nordic roots. And it's got another parent from the former Roman Empire. And in fact, it's got distant sort of cousins, aunts and grandparents all over the place. So really, it's a multiple heritage language. And in 1449, the Germanic tribes, the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes, they moved into Britain to take the side of the Celts, to push out the Norse neighbours. And after their victory, the Germanic tribes stayed on. They pushed the Celts westward into what became Wales and Cornwall. And they introduced Anglo-Saxon, which became known as Old English. I don't think they actually looked like that. But it'd be nice if they did, eh? Now, I've actually got a clip of Beowulf on my laptop, but I'm not absolutely convinced I can find it. But it's quite... Let me see if I can find it. I'll carry on, and if we get Beowulf, we're lucky. And if not, it doesn't really matter. Because in a minute, we're going to move on to somebody even more exciting. Actually, if we haven't got Beowulf, I'll recite you a little bit of... Do you know Piers Plowman? Who is... Yeah, okay, I won't bother with that then. In a summer season, when soft was the sun, he shrouded me in shrouders as I a sheep aware, inhabited and hermit, unholy of works, went wide into the world, wondrous for to hear. And that really is like the mystery and magic. that was almost the sort of pre-Norman English. And then in 1066, we had the Norman Conquest, and French became the official language. We're back to about, okay, hunky, isn't he, really? But Anglo-Saxon did survive in the population as a whole. And so, really, England became a sort of bilingual nation, especially among the sort of French families, where the younger generation would speak English and the older generation would speak French, a bit like my family. And eventually that melded into Middle English, and then into the language of Chaucer, Shakespeare, Jane Austen, The Sun, the Daily Telegraph, and now the language of Twitter. And so, in a way, this richness of English stems from the dual heritage, and it's been used by poets and authors from Chaucer and Shakespeare to the present day with great effect. Let's get rid of him. And so, on to Chaucer. Because here you can actually really see the seams between the French and the German roots. When that April, with his shores soot, the drocht of March hath pierced to the root, and bathed every vein in switch liquor, of which virtue engendered is the floor. And Zephyrus eke with his sweet breath, in spirit hath in every holt and heath the tendre cropus. And I don't know whether that's exactly how you're supposed to pronounce it, but that's the way that I was taught, that the French sounded very French and the German sounded very German, and it was the beginning of a really fantastic language sort of coming together from the two main strains. By the time you get on to Shakespeare, he was a bit better at it. And I mean, I've chosen almost at random this bit from Hamlet because I'm sure you'll all know it. It's from the To Be or Not to Be speech. For who would bear the whips and scorns of time, the oppressor's wrong, and the proud man's contumely, the pangs of despised love, the law's delay, the insolence of office, and the spurns that patient merit of the unworthy takes, when he himself might his quietus make with a bare bodkin? And so you've got the rather grand quietus, and then you've got the bodkin. I think this is just so fantastic. You almost anywhere in Shakespeare you find this sort of play between the two sort of parents, really, of English. But now listen to this. Bed bond, no, not bed bond, spear clash, sword haft shattered, hacked bones smashed, sparring skirmish, dust clouds, blood storm, Trojans, Greeks, not bed bond, bloodbath. You could be forgiven for thinking that's Old English, but in fact it's from a modern poet, Tony Harrison. He's very dramatically retelling the Orestian trilogy of Aeschylus and using English words which resonate with that sort of pre-Norman warrior culture and that alliterative metre which I read you came across in Piers Plowman and the typical of the earliest English poetry. So anyway, actually I could go on about poetry all evening, but I'll move on a bit. Because although English is a great language for writing poetry, and in fact English poetry is very rich and diverse, English culture doesn't offer many career prospects for poets. So I realised that I was going to have to earn my living in a different way. I trained as a teacher, and all the while in my spare time, when I had any spare time, I continued writing. Nowadays, when I go to do events and readings, people sometimes ask me why I carried on writing in the face of constant rejection, really, because I just had one rejection after another. And in fact, really, it wasn't something that I chose to do it. It was something that chose me. It was like an obsession. And in fact, I suppose the real answer is I must have been slightly bonkers. Anyway, and my day job as a teacher was also very satisfying and very varied. And, took me into many different highways and byways. And so in 1977, I found myself living in Leeds and teaching English to women from India, Pakistan and Bangladesh. In those days, it was called TESOL. In fact, before that, it was called ESL and then TESOL. And really, it was a hugely enjoyable time, which I'm sure, you all know, the pleasure of teaching adults who are there because they want to learn, because they bring their whole life experience and their humour and their cleverness into the class. And of course, having to tell them to shut up and stop messing about like you do with kids.